Hi, I'm Sean Fenske, editor of MPO and ODT Magazine, and I'm here with the debut episode of Mike on Medtech. I'm speaking with Mike Drues, president of Vascular Sciences and all-around regulatory guru. He is my go-to guy for all things regulatory related for the medical device industry, and I'd like to kick off this episode saying hi to you, Mike, and thank you for being a part of this video cast that we are going to be looking to do regularly.
Well, thank you, Sean, for that very kind introduction, and it's always a pleasure to speak with you and your audience.
Great. What we're going to be discussing today is recently in May there was the FDA finalized guidance on additive manufacturing and 3D printing for medical device manufacturers. And we're going to speak to Mike today to see what that's about, see what's in the guidance, see what's not in the guidance, and just get his viewpoint on what it means for medical device manufacturing. So, Mike, if you could tell us, basically, give us a quick overview of what the additive manufacturing and 3D printing guidance is that the FDA put out in May.
So sure, Sean, I'd be happy to do that. So just a little bit of an introduction. So additive manufacturing, or more commonly referred to as 3D printing, has actually been around for quite a while now. Here in the United States, there are now more than 85 medical devices that have been brought to the market, that is through the FDA, that are 3D printed. And in addition to that, one drug was also brought to the market just last year that was 3D printed as well. In the interest of full disclosure, I've had my fingers in many of these, certainly not all of them, but many of them. And one of the challenges that we face from a regulatory perspective is how do we bring these new revolutionary technologies to the market through a regulatory framework that, quite frankly, was never designed, was never intended for this kind of a thing. And that's one of the things that FDA is trying to address in this new guidance that that you mentioned was just finalized very recently. Think about it this way. When we take the blockbuster approach, that is, when we design a medical device that's going to be used with thousands or millions of people, or for that matter, when we design or develop a drug that's going to be used for thousands or millions of people, it makes sense to do a clinical trial of maybe a few hundred people. But when your intended patient population in personalized medicine, and 3D printing to me is just nothing more than personalized medicine, when your intended patient population is only one person, we're designing a medical device to put in one person, we're designing a drug to put in one person. How do we do a clinical trial of an intended patient population of one? I believe that there's a solution to every problem, and the first step is to get people to think and to think differently. So here's the way I look at it. When I look at a clinical trial as an engineer, I see nothing more than a validation. And by the way, validation is something that FDA gets into in the guidance. We'll talk more about that in a moment. But there's two ways that we can do a validation. One way is to validate the product. And by the way we do clinical trials today, whether it's a medical device or a drug, is essentially a product validation. But the other way that we can do a validation is to validate the process. So I think the solution to the personalized medicine clinical trial enigma for 3D printing, as additive manufacturing presents, is to validate the process, not the product. This is something that FDA starts to get into in this particular guidance, but I think quite a bit more needs to be said about that. But again, coming from an engineering background, I think it's important for your audience to remember that I don't need anybody, including the FDA, with all due respect, telling me how to do this. I need to figure out how to do this myself and then go to the FDA and sell it to them. As I mentioned, we've brought now 85 medical devices and one drug onto the market through the FDA long before this guidance came into an existence. So somebody's got to be first. We can figure out, we can lead as an industry and bring our ideas to the FDA and sell it to them.
Great, thanks for that. So realistically, in terms of the guidance itself, what is the most notable aspect, or what is the takeaway for the device manufacturers? What are they really going to get value from it from this version at least?
So in this particular guidance, the FDA breaks it into sort of two general areas. One is on the design and the manufacturing side, which includes, for example, quality requirements, and we can talk about those more in a moment. And the other is on the testing side. But one of the things that FDA points out, and I agree with them 100%, and by the way, just in the interest of full disclosure, I should also remind your audience that in addition to consulting for a wide variety of medical device companies, I also work as a consultant for the FDA, so I see a lot of these issues from both sides. On the device testing side, one of the things that the FDA points out in this guidance is that additional device-specific requirements will likely apply based on the indications, on the technology, on the risk, and so on and so on. So there are certain issues that are unique to making a device to 3D printing, for example, but there are other issues, other testing requirements that are going to be ubiquitous across the board. For example, one of the devices that we brought to market about 2 years ago that was 3D printed was the first 3D printed implantable knee. Now, there are some things, some kinds of testing that we need to do to ensure the quality and the V&V on the 3D printing side, but there's a ton of information. Knee implants have been around for a very long time, and the testing requirements for those kinds of implants are very well established. So basically, my advice to your audience and to this industry in general is to do your homework. If you're bringing a device onto the market, treat it in sort of two different ways. First, look at the 3D printing side of it. In other words, what do you need to show FDA in terms of the reliability of the manufacturing method? And 3D printing or additive manufacturing, to me, is nothing more than a new manufacturing method. But the other side of the equation that we have to remember is what is already out there that's required for testing. As I said, with the knee, for example, there's a whole bunch of testing requirements that are necessary for prosthetic knees, regardless of the method of manufacture that you use to make them. So break that into two halves. That will be a very good first step.
Great. So definitely testing. Obviously, that's something that's common with all medical devices. It sounds like they've got that well covered in the guidance. What is it that they have not done a good job of covering in this guidance for additive manufacturing and 3D printing?
Well, that's a great question, Sean. To be fair, this is still a relatively new area, and regulation always has a challenge in keeping up with new technologies. I think areas where we really need a lot more information, and by the way, I strongly believe this information does not have to come from FDA. As a matter of fact, it should not come from FDA. It should come from us. We're the experts on whatever technology that we're using to bring our device to the market. So we, as engineers, should figure out what is necessary, what needs to be done, and then we need to go to the FDA and sell it to them. But that said, as I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, I think one of the areas that people really need to do a lot more thinking about is on the quality side, on the whole verification and validation, or V&V side. But again, to me, philosophically, V&V for a 3D printed device is really no different than V&V for a device that's produced via some traditional manufacturing process. I'll give you a quick example. So one of the basic premises of verification and validation, and this is right out of the design controls, is to validate your manufacturing process. That is, to make sure that your devices are manufactured to certain specs, the right sizes, the right material properties, the right composition, and so on and so on. Well, we apply that same principle to the 3D printing process. If a physician says, I want a device to be 3D printed that is, say, 30 millimeters long, we need to make sure, we need to do the validation that the device coming out of that 3D printer is going to be 30 millimeters long, plus or minus some fudge factor, of course. So the principle of validation, I think, is exactly the same. Therefore, I really don't think, and I'm a little perhaps different in the industry, I really don't think we need a lot of very special guidance or regulation for 3D printing. I think if we understand truly what the regulation is requiring us to do, or reminding us to do, as we should be doing anyway as prudent engineers, I think that can be applied very nicely to other manufacturing methods like 3D printing.
So essentially, I mean, and what you're saying, if I understand correctly, is that the engineers really should view themselves as the experts as to what's required for testing, for validation. They know what needs to be done, what the FDA looks for. The only problem with that is it seems like in this industry, nobody wants to make a move until they know it will pass through. So how, for lack of a better word, how realistic is it to expect device makers who are, operating in this industry to take that approach, to lead instead of following a guidance or following someone else who's gone first?
Well, that's an excellent question, Sean. And unfortunately, that's a question that really is not unique to 3D printing. That's a question that really sort of spans our industry. Let's be very honest, as you just pointed out, most companies do not want to be the first through the doors at FDA with a new technology or a new device for a whole bunch of reasons, not the least of which is the unknown regulatory pathway. Me being the contrarian that I am, I love to be the first through the doors at FDA, because if I'm the first, it gives me the opportunity to get the FDA to think the way I want them to think, which to me is a very significant tactical advantage, as opposed to if I'm the second or the third or the fourth through the doors at the FDA, and let's say I want to do something different than what the folks did before me. Now I have to make the argument that what the people did before me was not appropriate or perhaps even wrong, and what I want to do is better. Don't get me wrong here. I've been successful both ways, but given a choice, I would much prefer to be the first through the doors at the FDA, because then I won't have that baggage, if you will, that I'll have to carry of what people did before me. But as I said, let's be very honest here. Most people, most companies don't want to do that. We have in this industry, I hate to say it, a lot of Me Too's, a lot of copying and pasting going on. We don't have very many truly new or novel products. And by the way, I'll take that a half a step further. Oftentimes people describe to me what they're working on as something truly new or novel. And when I listen to it, it's really not new or novel. So I've developed sort of a litmus test. If you think you're working on something new or novel, ask yourself these two questions. Is there regulation on it? Is there guidance on it? And is there a reimbursement code for it? If there's regulation or guidance on it, and if there's a reimbursement code for it, then I hate to burst your bubble, but you're really not working on something new or novel. So, so 3D printing really is one of the newer technologies that really gives us the opportunity to do some cool things. The last thing that I wanted to share with you and your audience from that particular guidance is one of FDA's most important recommendations, which I think I agree with 100%. They say if it's unclear what technical information should be provided in a pre-market submission for an additive manufactured device, we, meaning FDA, strongly encourages manufacturers to engage with the FDA through the pre-submission or pre-sub process to obtain more detailed feedback. I could not agree with that statement more. As a matter of fact, this is my standard operating procedure, not just when it comes to 3D printing, but with medical devices across the board. I find it, here's an interesting statistic for your audience, 70 to 75% of submissions of 510K and PMA submissions to FDA, 70 to 75% of them are rejected first time out of the box. I hear a lot of my regulatory friends, they say their goal is to get their 510K cleared or their PMA approved. That has never been my goal because, quite frankly, anybody can do that. My goal is to get my 510K cleared or my PMA approved, ideally first time out of the box if I can. If I can't, with a minimum of ping pongs of Q&As going back and forth. Am I successful 100% of the time? No, but I can tell you I'm in the 20 to 25%, not in the 70, 75%. And there's a lot of ingredients that go into my secret sauce to achieve that, which are probably beyond the scope of this podcast. But the most important ingredient is this: communication with FDA. Frequent, early, often communication with FDA. I work really hard to get all of my questions asked long before the submission goes in, so that once the submission goes in, assuming the data shows what I want it to show, then it's essentially a done deal. In other words, they just apply their signatures and we're done. So on one hand, I'm a huge fan of communication with FDA, but there's a caveat to that. I see a lot of folks, and remember, I consult for the FDA as well, so I see this from both sides. I see a lot of folks come to FDA and ask, what do we do? And in my opinion, that's a terrible strategy. I've seen people come in with 3D printed products and say, we want to 3D print this medical device. What do we do? How do we do it? That has disaster written all over it in every language for a couple of reasons. First of all, as we talked about before, it's not FDA's job to tell us what to do. It's our job to figure out what to do from an engineering and biology perspective, and then take it to the FDA and sell it to them. But second, the reason why that's a terrible strategy is because you're opening up a Pandora's box and you have no idea what to expect in return. So my mantra has become: tell, don't ask, lead, don't follow. Go to FDA very confidently, very definitively, and say, here's our device. Oh, by the way, we're going to be 3D printing it. That's our manufacturing method. Here's the way it works. Here's what it does. Here's what we're going to say about it. Here's the testing that we've done thus far. Here's the testing that we're planning on doing next. And you lay all of our cards on the table, so to speak. And, you know, at the end of my presentations at FDA, Sean, I don't even ask the reviewers if they have questions. Because believe me, if there are reviewers in the room, if they have questions, they will ask them. That's their job. So I strongly recommend, I strongly agree with FDA's recommendation. Come to them in advance to talk about it. But remember my caveat: tell, don't ask, lead, don't follow. This is applicable across the board in the medical device industry. It is especially applicable in new areas like 3D printing.
Well, you definitely offered a lot there, and I don't think I'd be incorrect in predicting that we'll hear that mantra in future broadcasts when speaking with you. So just a couple final questions. Do you foresee any significant changes or addendums being made to this guidance, or do you think it's going to pretty much remain as is, with the caveat that, kind of like you said, go in with the expertise, be the expert to the FDA, so that they can perhaps learn from you, but more accurately, perhaps follow from your presumed expertise on the topic of your device, your manufacturing method that you've selected, instead of walking in and basically admitting that you're ignorant to what you need to do next. Will there be changes, to this guidance?
Well, that's a terrific question, Sean. And actually, I think the answer, not to be a bit evasive, is maybe or maybe not. And here's why. On the maybe side, the short answer to every question in regulatory affairs, there's no exceptions, is it depends. So this is sort of a maybe, maybe not, is kind of like saying it depends. But here's what I mean by that. On one side, on the maybe side, as you and your audience know, all regulation and especially guidance documents are very evolutionary. They're constantly evolving. We're supposed to be adding to them more as we learn more with our experience, obviously. But on the other side, I'll use the design control guidance as an example. The design control guidance was issued in 1997, almost 20 years ago. That guidance has not been updated in nearly 20 years. Many people have called for that guidance to be updated. I have recommended to FDA many times, don't touch that guidance, because design controls, like 3D printing, design controls apply across the board, and we don't want very specific guidance. Philosophically, I think that guidance for design controls is very good. It reminds us to do the things that we as prudent engineers should know to do anyway, but the guidance remind us, for example, verification and validation, sterility testing, shelf life, biocompatibility, all that kind of basic sort of biomedical engineering 101 kind of stuff. I don't think it needs to be it needs to be more rigorous. I like very general, very broad regulation as opposed to very specific regulation, because the more general, the more broad, the more non-specific, the more nebulous the regulation is, the more wiggle room it gives me in terms of being able to do what I think as a professional biomedical engineer and regulatory professional needs to be done. Similarly, on the 3D printing side, I think that the 3D printing guidance that was just finalized, as we've been talking about, is a pretty good start. It is not perfect, but the way I view it is kind of like the design control guidance. Yes, we can make a few little adjustments, we can tweak it here and there, but I really don't think it needs a heck of a lot more work. And let me remind your audience of one other thing. Even though that guidance was finalized just a couple of months ago, final does not necessarily mean what most people think. I hear lots of, I have lots of people and lots of companies calling me. They say they have done everything that was listed in a final guidance, and yet FDA seems to think it's not enough. And what I remind them, what I say to them is, well, why would you think that a final guidance means final? Final does absolutely not mean final. All regulation, including guidance, I don't care if it says draft or final on the front, all regulation is very evolutionary. It's a beginning, it's a starting point. So just because you do what is specified in a, quote, final guidance, doesn't necessarily mean that you're done. You have to ask yourself, from a biology perspective, from an engineering perspective, what makes sense? And then incorporate that from the guidance or the regulation. If you take that approach, you'll have a much higher likelihood of success of getting your 3D printed device or any device through the FDA. I've been playing this game, as you know, Sean, for now approaching 25 years. I guess I'm getting a little bit old. And that has always been my mantra. Certainly consult the regulation, but at the end of the day, we have to do what makes sense.
Well, that's definitely a great way to look at it. And I think in terms of nebulous regulation, I'm sure you'd have quite a healthy debate with some regulatory professionals out there in the field who are the complete opposite, who can't stand that it's a nebulous and nondescript, very broad guidelines. But that's how it is, and it seems to be the FDA is functioning that way, and it's better that you embrace it than try and fight it. So before we wrap up, I just want to give you an opportunity to make any final comments or just close out.
Well, sure, Sean. And again, thank you for the opportunity to share some thoughts with you and your audience. My most important advice is this. When it comes to a 3D printed medical device, or for that matter, any medical device, we talked a little bit at the end here about the relationship between the company and the FDA. I view this very much as a partnership. I don't want to treat the FDA as an obstacle, as a hurdle, as a set of hoops to jump through in order to get my device onto the market. I want to work together as much as possible to do what makes sense, as I've said, from an engineering perspective and from a biology perspective. I often say to the companies that I work with, if we come up with what makes sense from an engineering and a biology perspective, in other words, if I can sell this from an engineering and a biology perspective, don't worry about it. I'll sell it to the FDA. Our goal here should be to do what makes sense from a technology and a medical perspective, and not simply from the regulatory. There's an adage that we use in medicine frequently, and that is, the surgery went perfectly, but the patient died anyway. Well, the engineering equivalent of that is we designed the medical device perfectly, and yet the patient died anyway. The regulatory equivalent of that is we followed the regulation perfectly. That is, we did all that FDA asked us to do, and yet the patient died anyway. Unfortunately, these things happen more often than some people might think. And so my most important message to you and to your audience, applicable in 3D printing, but applicable in all medical device areas, is work together and be a leader. Go to the FDA, be very definitive, very confident, and say, here's our device, here's the way it works, here's our labeling, here's our testing, and so on and so on. And this is what makes sense to do from an engineering and a medical perspective. If we do that, I can just about guarantee that we're going to really bring some very significant medical devices onto the market in the future. And 3D printing is just another wonderful new opportunity for us to do things, not just to do things that we've already done in the past, but to do things that we have not been done in the past. This is truly a novel technology that I think we're just at the beginning of.
And with that, I'm going to wrap up. I'd like to thank you for watching, of course. This has been the debut episode of Mike on Medtech, featuring Mike Drues, who I'd like to also thank for being a part of this. And we look forward to bringing you the next episode, which will be posted to the MPO website when it's available. So look there, and also subscribe to the newsletter at the website, and we'll be presenting it in there as well. Once again, thank you for joining us, and have a wonderful day.